In this episode, we learn about some of the big mistakes we can make when we obsess over rules instead of story. Make sure to like, follow, and subscribe whether you're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. And share this episode with a friend if you'd be so kind. My name is GM Smudge, and welcome to the Smudgecast. Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Smudgecast, where I help you put to practice good storytelling for your D&D games. And yes, you can have amazing, epic stories where you have friends that come together, and you remember these stories forever. And you can actually have some really crappy stories, some really clunky ones, where everyone feels sort of disconnected and don't actually understand what's going on, which is why we're here. What do we want? We want to experience so many more memories and add value to our games when it comes to playing D&D as a player and as a GM. And it's true, we can have amazing sessions and we can have some pretty lame sessions, but this is why we want to come together and learn a little bit about how do we actually storytell, how do we actually put to practice some of these good storytelling routines, methods, and build those roots in us as players, as GMs for our games. And let me tell you something. I used to do something that I don't typically do anymore. I do a little bit, but I definitely used to do this before. I used to love reading up and watching vids about mechanics, specifically within rules, and applying really unique, interesting, and creative mechanics to your games. Maybe as a GM, you're kind of like, that's not anything that I do. And some of you are like, actually, I do that on the daily. But what I found is something probably not really unique, but just something that sparked me in my storytelling adventures, if you will, where there was this moment back in my third campaign. There was this moment where I wanted to build around this a mechanics around a ship that I just built. It took me like 2.5 months to build this ship, and I saw someone talk about having this specific mechanics where it would be 4 different rounds, 4 characters, maybe 5 characters, whatever, how many rounds, depending on how many characters you have. And what they needed to do on this ship was to navigate the ship using specific components of the ship. That would be 2 harpoons, there would be the anchor, and then someone up in the crow's nest. So 4 players, 4 rounds, and they would need to roll 4 100% successful low skill checks. Like I said, using the 2 harpoon guns, an anchor, and watching from the crow's nest. Now, guess what happened? I think you probably can figure it out even right now, is that the moment came. I was so hyped to get this mechanic used, and I got them all set up. They're like, okay, yeah, go over here, you go over here. And then the moment where we were actually going to start rolling and get them set up, one of the the rocks come, and one of the characters goes, I'm going to dive into the water. And I just went, no, the Frodo meme of screaming no. Like, I was just like, no, I set this whole mechanic up. Why would you defer to your own desires that may actually plan out to be somewhat even more fun and experiential for us? Why would you choose that? You see what the issue that I'm talking about is and if you don't, it's about making decisions first on mechanics versus first on your story. I think one of the biggest controversies in D&D, it might be something that you've seen, but maybe you have, where it's kind of pitting the rules versus the story, or the rules versus the flavor. You have that rules lawyer player or the rules lawyer GM versus the flavor fanatic of the player or GM, and they're kind of at odds with one another. And look, GM Smudge, I am not trying to pin them or you and your party against one another with this conversation. I understand, as probably more than just like the rest of you truly, is that we need a foundation to play. We gotta have rules. I love rules. I live in my own rules lawyer mentality as well. Stories themselves need foundations. They need rails. They need bumpers to maintain your creativity, or else what happens when we don't have bumpers in creativity? Chaos. It's complete chaos. The heartbeat of D&D isn't rules, though. It's what? a collaborative story. But rules are the DNA. They're the structures of the actual story that kind of keeps it moving and maintaining and making it make sense continually. But structures, they do change. They can change. And if we stay locked in chains with rules at times, I think that could do some damage to the game. You're spending 30 minutes later reviewing something and now you're kind of like back to the story. Oh, that's way too long. You've just read 3 books. You go to the DMG, now you're looking into these other different adventures that are offering different types of rule systems and mechanics. And you're like, ugh, this is too much. Might I just add what the DMG actually says when it comes to rules? And I think we all know what this actually means and what I'm getting to, but I want to read exactly what the Dungeon Master's Guide actually says about rules. This is what it says. The D&D rules help you and the other players have a good time, but the rules aren't in charge. You're the DM and you are in charge of the game. That said, your goal isn't to slaughter the adventurers, but to create a campaign world that revolves around their actions and decisions and to keep your players coming back for more. If you're lucky, the events of your campaign will echo in the memories of your players long after the final session is concluded. Now, I read that. I actually agree with the first part and disagree with the last part. The first part being all about, the DM is sort of like, not necessarily the DM is in charge of the game. They're the ones that kind of help set the pace. So I kind of disagree with that. The players have a huge role and responsibility with maintaining the adventure as well, within their actions and their decisions. So I'm all in with that. But the last sentence is, if you're lucky, the events of the campaign will echo within memories, etc. I disagree with that wholeheartedly. Not if you're lucky. It's if you're intentional, if you want to choose to have amazing campaign stories and campaign moments. Not if you're lucky, if you're intentional. And as a player, sometimes the rules though feel so annoying, and again, I've experienced this too. If you're just trying to like jump across something and your GM goes like makes you roll a bunch and it just happens to land on one and you're just like, come on, I'm just trying to jump across a river. Like this, me jumping in the crowd, and now there's this whole story of like me in the water, and it's like it's really unnecessary. It's not adding to the actual story at all. And I think that's actually why we're seeing 1D&D happening. And if you don't know what's 1D&D, it's sort of the taking what we have with 5th edition and holistically taking it to a whole nother level, refining down a little bit of the rules in a way that makes continual sense based on what everybody across the world is doing within D&D. And I actually think that's why the past 50 years of D&D, all the editions, I feel like it's just taken us 50 years to figure out how to actually play the game. Okay, so now we actually have a decent structure. But in the end, if I'm being honest, who cares? I have so many memories and so many moments that I have in my head that have nothing to do about rules, but had everything to do about where the story led us down to and how we experienced it. And truth be told, I've also had so many moments where I've done the correct rulings, but the moment sucked. The moment actually was not fun and the moment wasn't flavorful, but by golly, I got the rules correct. I think deep down for me, I'd rather get the ruling wrong than have a player or a group of people get annoyed. And I'm talking about truly the things that we can control, like when, how, why to add a rule into your story. Now, there are several issues that occur when we obsess on rules over the story. And hear me, my issue isn't rules themselves at all. Trust me, I love my rules. I'm studying my rules. My DM screen has just a plethora amount of rules to help me remember and to live by. But it's about how and when we apply them. I think about this, a couple ways that we start to focus on obsessing and focusing on our rules versus our story. What are a couple things that happen? I think what happens when we do that is we start to plan mechanics and not scenes. It's so funny to me how hard I had to learn this. And the moment I did learn it, I feel like it's been just like cruise control ever since. And let me say this too, mechanics are so fun to create and lead with, and I'll be the first to say, but at the end of the day, when you're in your game and your group decides to change plans and do something else, now what the hell are you gonna do? Force a mechanic later that you've created that didn't get used? And as a player, I feel it. I've felt it, and watching other people play, based on these pro D&D players, people on Twitch, etc. Like, I see it play out, and it can just feel so defeating at times when we're like, the rule matters more than what is actually happening in the story. I feel it. And so a couple different things that I've thought through when it comes to, instead of figuring out how do we focus on planning a mechanic versus planning a scene, I think definitely, like I said, plan the scene, plan the story, plan out kind of the different options and where you want to see play out. GMs and players, prepare yourself as where you, again, like we will constantly say, plan out and have a guide of where your character's goal lies and how you want to see that play out the best that you can, and let your GM know that. But from a GM standpoint, looking at the mechanics versus scenes, I think when you do have a mechanic that you're like, oh, I would love to try this, this is probably super cool, just keep that mechanic in your back pocket. Just keep it in your back pocket. Maybe write it down, have it next to you whenever you need, but use the mechanic when it actually makes sense in the scene or the story that it applies to. But for quick practice for yourself in learning how to not be obsessed with mechanics and choosing to be obsessed over like scenes and interesting problems for your party, I actually did this practice for myself. I went to Instagram and I went to my stories and I asked a question, which, again, if you're not following me on Instagram, or if you're not chatting with me about your story, please do, at GM Smudge. Love to be able to interact with you about your story, etc. And getting some polls and some help down the road from you. But what I did was I put a poll out that, hey, question, give me a random location, give me a random conflict, and a random object. And someone, actually one of my good friends named Shafgus, that's his IG Instagram. He does some really cool art. Please go find him if you can. He sent me the ever-burning forest, a princess's forbidden love for a commoner, and a devil's ear. Such random stuff. And I was thinking about that. I'm just like, okay, well, maybe how do I create a story or create a scene about this? And instead of creating a scene specifically for it, what I did was, to help support my scenes, maybe whether that's an improv moment or whether it's just something that I want to think about later, I sort of created some scene types that I could take for that and maybe do something interesting. Now, I have about 30 of these scenes, but I was reading through a couple of them, like, maybe what would make sense, and here are just a couple based on this random location, Everburning Forest, a prince's forbidden love for a commoner. That's a conflict, and the devil's ear, this weird item, which I'm kind of curious about. A session type would be eavesdropping, having group follow and wait and hide behind maybe the prince and try to get some secret information, or who they got this devil's ear from, etc. Or maybe do some typical investigating, but doing it more a little bit around mystery, gathering clues and stuff. Like, I call this my detective investigation. Really, think about the questions: who gave him the ear? Who's this commoner? Why do they want to be with this commoner? Another session type that you can start thinking about versus just your mechanic, but think about the scenes, is I call it identity theft. A group must disguise themselves to get or do something, or take somebody else's identity. Just interesting. These are the kinds of things that I'm thinking through. These are the scenes or the session types that I'm kind of thinking about when I get something that my players are wanting to do, or just in general, versus first and foremost, I don't even know what kind of mechanic I want to put for this because it means nothing. The mechanic means nothing, but the scene, the opportunities of storytelling are immense in those moments. And if you want some of these session types, these 30, go ahead and DM me on, like I said, at GM Smudge. More than happy to do that with you on Instagram. Another thing that I've been thinking about when it comes to obsessing over rules instead of story and what happens because of that is typical party disengagement. And let me tell you, you can't bounce back from it. And I'm going to talk as a player here in this situation. I've seen it firsthand as a player playing in full campaigns or playing in one shots or listening, like I said, to pro D&D, there's this weird moment that can happen when GMs, even me, miss what we miss because we GMs have these rules that we hold so high in regard to and create decisions around. And it's just this awkward moment where us as players are sitting there. It's this moment when we have this dope idea that logistically actually does make sense, but the rules overcome the idea and create such a workaround for us to actually get what we potentially are looking for. Then guess what? We all get upset and feel like the GM is out to get us because now we have to roll all these different dice for different reasons that at the end of the day, all I was just looking for was a flavor moment. Or if you're watching the player and GM go at it because both have different ideas of what the mechanic or rule should be, so it becomes a court trial and the rest of the party has to kind of like pick sides. And then like, guess what? 10-20 minutes passes and the question of like, where are we again? Happens and you're just sitting there. See what happens? And again, I'm not saying that this should never happen. I'm just saying be careful, GM, be careful, rules lawyer, player. And again, in the grand scheme of things, that rule will not destroy your story. I've truly never experienced a player as a player or a GM want to do something that is so outlandish that it breaks the game. Truly. Like, never seen it. It probably won't happen. So please, remember, think about your story and think about how socially aware you could be to make sure that people aren't in disagreement or people are just like having a bad time. Because that'll be a memory that we do remember versus a memory that we could remember that's based on the story and our characters. And the last one that I was thinking of is when we obsess around rules instead of the story, and what happens is that we constrain ourselves and our story. Sometimes I think that we think that we are keeping our story in order when we implement or obsess on the rules. It's actually the opposite. We can limit or constrain our story with how we enforce the rules. I remember in my third campaign, I enforced this sort of like no arcane focus like rule with components. Like if you didn't have an arcane focus and you didn't have certain components to cast your spell, then you couldn't do it and you couldn't cast your spell. And that idea, that mechanic was kind of cool in the moment, but the gameplay then it just bogged down with them finding random shit all the time. Like they spent time going to places to just buy all their like weird strings that have been inside of a witch's hair. I don't know, like random stuff. To boil this down a little bit better, a rule is just simply a rule for a specific moment, not the same rule operating for every single moment. Now I tell my players that when I play, a rule makes sense in this moment, but we're probably going to use it in a different way later. So keep your expectations aligned here that we may use this rule in this specific moment, but guess what? It might be different in an hour from now that actually may make a little bit more sense or less sense, so we have to change it up a little bit. I feel like some kind of, when I say all this, like some hippy-dippy guy, let your stories be free, man. Like, no, I'm not trying to say that, but players, let me say this to you too. What I've started doing is offer up my story moment or what I want to do, and then provide a like kind of like a suggestion right after to support what I want to do. For instance, I'm looking to run up a tree, and instead of climbing with my athletics, I might ask, can I use acrobatics because of da-da-da-da-da-da, because I'm proficient in acrobatics, I'm not proficient in athletics, blah, 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 blah. And I make my case, I hope it works, and guess what? If the GM says no, I leave the table, and I never talk to them ever again. Just kidding. Don't do that. That's not what I'm saying. But for GMs, what I've also started doing too as a GM is to offer more than one ruling option for situations. So again, similarly, hey, you want to climb up the tree, roll with athletics or roll acrobatics, whatever you want to in that moment. Of course, not a medicine check, duh, but you can kind of rule it a little bit that what makes sense for you based on your class, based on what you're looking for in that moment. But if we're all as a group not careful, we can get so bogged down by the rules of this game and not enjoy our story. Because guess what? None of this is real anyway. So let me just be the hero I want to be. I hope this week you find yourself caring a little bit more about your story versus what mechanic you're going to use and how it's going to plan out and what your players are going to think about the rule. Or as a player, man, I hope I actually get to do whatever I really want to do this week, or else or is my GM going to make me roll 30 different times just to try to steal something this week? No, I hope you really find yourself coming to, like, you know what? Roll your sleight of hand check. DC is going to be pretty low because I know that this doesn't matter as much in this moment. And so a win for you could be just stealing some sort of small magic item, whatever it might be. Because again, at the end of the day, do you want to say, I enforce the rules so well, or geez, my GM sure knows how to use rules, or that was the dopest shit I've played in weeks, and I want to play again? Well, the only way that we're going to get there is that if we get intentional about storytelling in our games as players and GMs. So please like, subscribe, hit the bell, follow on Spotify and Apple Podcasts so that we can get you notified each week when an episode drops. And please, like I said, if you'd be so kind, share with a friend, share with your party. Let's all grow in putting into practice some good storytelling in our games. And also comment below. I'd love to know, what kind of story are you telling right now? What's your game currently all about? And maybe you should just share a little bit about what you love about it. And lastly, make sure to add value to your game so that your game becomes more memorable. See you later.